Today we're enjoying the bright and beautiful sunny day at the book festival in Louisiana. And I am Zeke Elmshade, traveling satyr and storyteller, working with Line by Line Publishing. And I am here to enjoy the beautiful breeze and to see what all these amazing books and storytellers are doing.
Today we're at the 16th Annual Louisiana Book Festival presenting the Louisiana Writer Award to Richard Campanella. It's important to know about Louisiana. It's important to be a reader and a thinker. If Louisiana wants to compete in a global economy, which we do, we have to have a culture of literacy, which is the root of everything we do at the State Library. Richard's work is a good example of taking a tough topic, a complicated topic, and breaking it down to where people can understand it and enjoy it. And I think that's good for children. We have a lot for children here today. So we really want to start a culture or build this culture of literacy in Louisiana through everything that we do. Louisiana's not always at the top of the list for things. And this is something we're on the top of the list for, writers. The number of writers that come here and visit are inspired to write about Louisiana. So they come back, they write books. It adds to our cultural economy, so to speak, those artistic things that we make money on. It's important for us to change our rankings on those lists of things that the world judges us by. And we need to maintain our smart people. We don't want our young people to get smart and then leave. We try to keep them here. So we have to build a place for them to want to stay and have children. Louisiana, the Book Festival, and the State Library are my first loves. I have a staff that makes it all happen. The State Library of Louisiana existed far before me. We stand on the shoulders of people before us. But the staff at the State Library of Louisiana today really do everything to make this festival happen because it means something to all of us. And when we see all the people smiling, from the little tiny babies all the way up, we think, well, we've done a good job. Geographer, historian, professor, and Louisiana transplant Richard Campanella by presenting him with the 20th Louisiana Writer Award. This award is given annually to recognize outstanding contributions to Louisiana's literary and intellectual life, exemplified by a living writer's body of work.
How honored I feel to be selected for the Louisiana Writer Award, for which I express my gratitude to the selection committee, to Susan Larson, who's been such a dedicated advocate for the literary community, to Jim Davis and the Louisiana Center for the Book, and to State Librarian Rebecca Hamilton. I research and write about historical geography, focusing on Louisiana and particularly New Orleans. It's been the topic of almost all of my 11 books and most of my articles, and I try to make it interesting. Honored and humbled by it, and I hope it's a signal that geography can and should be interesting, and it's not just about memorizing capitals. We are such a profoundly geographical state, from the hills and terraces to the rare fluvial delta that we have, and the amazingly diverse number of groups of people who have occupied this place.
I was invited to come and give an author talk at the Louisiana Book Festival, and this has been just a wonderful experience. The hospitality is incredible. The quality of the authors are amazing, and it was so much fun giving this talk in the Louisiana Senate Chamber, which was kind of a surreal experience. My book is titled The Downtown Pup Underground, and it's about a bunch of weirdos and outsiders who lived in New York City in the 60s and the 1970s, and they found ways of sort of reinventing art, music, and also just what it is to be human, because they broke down a lot of barriers and they made it possible for the acceptance of gay and transgender life in America today. I mean, that revolution really started in New York during that time period, and that's partially what the book's about. But the book is also just about the ways that artists sort of fed off of each other and got ideas from each other. So like Patti Smith, she started out before she was a punk rock singer as a poet and also as a theater performer. Reading and book culture is just so important. I have 2 small children, and I think it's just important to find fun ways of like getting families out and getting people and citizens engaged at every kind of level with book reading. I had this idea to write this book 30 years ago when I was 18 years old, and I was just about to enter college, and I just interviewed one of my favorite singers, Lou Reed, who is in one of my favorite bands, the Velvet Underground, and this book for me is just the culmination of like 30 years of thinking and passion, and And my career as an author started like 30 years ago with this book idea at that moment. And so it's so wonderful to be here in Louisiana to share it with you all. Basically, a year and a half before their debut album ever came out, they appeared on Walter Cronkite's CBS Evening News as part of a 8-minute news story about underground scenes that are happening in New York City. So that's just one example of the way this kind of dialogue between, subcultures and the underground scenes that were happening downtown and the mainstream America that was represented in national news broadcasts and so on. There's this real conversation. And so I talk about in the book how this conversation had liberating effects because it wasn't just contained to those few blocks, basically 1 square mile area of downtown New York. It eventually made its way through little, bursts, little kind of whispered secrets into mainstream media and made its way across the country, which planted subversive seeds in many people's minds, realizing that, there is another world that may exist beyond what I live in right now. So, the author's note first, and then I'll go back to the beginning. The liberating ripple effects that originated in downtown New York eventually reached Iowa City, where I now live, as well as other cultural peripheries like Virginia Beach, my hometown. I was first introduced to punk via mass media at the age of 9 when Debbie Harry guest starred on The Muppet Show singing One Way or Another in 1980.
I am at the Louisiana Book Festival giving an author talk about my book, The Queen, The Forgotten Life Behind an American Myth. This book means a lot of work. It's a reported story about a woman whose life story had never been told. And so it's something that I really was passionate about, surfacing a story that had such a dramatic impact on our politics and policy through this woman, Linda Taylor's narrative. It was really great to be in Louisiana. I'm from New Orleans, so to be able to talk about my book here felt really special, and I'm glad to have done it. I think just having an awareness of our political history and how individual stories can have a dramatic impact on our lives in the future, I think that's a really powerful lesson as far as just, following the news and understanding how stories are told, and that it's not just an academic thing, that it can actually have really powerful impact on, everyday people. In 1974, she came to prominence because she was written about in the Chicago Tribune first, and then a bunch of papers nationwide. The first story that was written about her in the Tribune was September of 1974, and it identified her as a woman in Chicago who had received welfare benefits under all sorts of different names, and that she drove a Cadillac and other luxury cars, that she was about to leave Chicago on a Hawaiian vacation, that she owned multiple buildings on the South Side, and dressing in the most flamboyant possible outfits. So nobody really sympathized with her. The jury certainly didn't sympathize with her. She ended up getting 7 years in prison. And another thing that fascinated me, and was a reason I wanted to tell this story, was she's a really well-known national figure. She's associated with this term welfare queen that becomes very well-known. And as soon as she goes to prison, nobody ever writes about her again. She's totally forgotten. When I started working on this, nobody knew what happened to her after she got out of prison, where she went, whether she was alive or dead, anything. And the term welfare queen lives on, and other people are given that terminology. But it was also like her, even the stuff that had been known about her was erased. People started writing in the 80s that Reagan had made her up totally, that she never even existed. And so I wanted to figure out, how could it be that somebody who was covered so extensively could be so thoroughly forgotten
I'm here for a panel with Margaret McCullen talking about memoir. Read The Yellow House, my debut book, which is a finalist for the National Book Award. It's about the coming of age of someone from New Orleans East, which is a section of New Orleans that we rarely ever hear about. There are no books really about New Orleans East until now, so I feel that this is a compelling and important narrative for all of us. Oh, it was fantastic. Great questions. I love the crowd. Really warm. Nice to be home. It means an entire amount for me and for my 50 nieces and nephews and my 11 brothers and sisters. It's a record for us. It goes into history. It will exist beyond us.
Distance lends perspective, but it can also shade, misinterpret. From these great heights, my brother Carl would not be seen. Carl, who is also my brother Rabbit, sits his days and nights away at 4121 Wilson Avenue at least 5 times a week after working his maintenance job at NASA, or when he is not fishing or near to the water where he loves to be.
This year it is Spooky's Second Line.
It fits
Children's
with
book.
Halloween, doesn't
Exactly. I wanted to write a book about the second lines and jazz funerals, but writing a book for children, I thought that's kind of a morbid topic. But then I thought, Halloween, that would be great. And a friend of mine, Amy Devoisin, she had a spooky second line in the French Quarter. And it just hit me like that. And Antoinette D.L. Terrace, part of Pelican, we were talking and I said, spooky second line, oh my goodness, that's a book. So I wrote about jazz funerals to teach children in a fun way, and all the characters are like the pumpkin and all they're the musicians in the second line band, and then the community joins in. And
well,
so
Louisiana is becoming a really cute topic for children's books.
so many children's books.
know.
I mean, it's because of our rich culture here. It's just the topics are endless. I mean, you just every day you go, oh, I wish I'd have thought of that one. That's a good one, you know. And we have so much heritage. We have the legends and lore and Cajun folklore. So it's just a life spring, you know, to draw from.
Did you always want to write children's books?
I did. I started out writing children's poetry and children's songs, and then it sort of just went into writing children's books. And my friend Debbie Kader asked me to. She really liked one of my songs, "Today Is Monday in Louisiana," and she said, can I illustrate that and make it into a book?" Sure, it'd be fantastic. So she sent it to Pelican Publishing, and that's how it started with Today Is Monday in Louisiana, and it's just been rolling
Well,
since
I know
then.
this is not your first time at the Louisiana Book Festival.
No.
So tell us about this festival and why it's so great.
It's an amazing festival. It's one of my favorites because, you know, it's a festival. We love festivals in Louisiana, so we'll have a festival for everything, you know. And so to have it about a book is amazing. So to have this many authors in one place, and what I like, because I'm a children's book author, I like that children can come with their families and they can talk to an author, you know, and really meet that author there, and they can get us an autograph. And for me as an author, I like meeting other authors and getting to see families come up and, you know, having a camaraderie with other authors.
My book is called The Magnetic Girl, and The Magnetic Girl is the imagined story of a real girl whose name was Lulu Hurst, who performed on the vaudeville stage from about 1883 to 1885 as the Magnetic Girl, or the Georgia Wonder. And what Lulu Hurst, the real Lulu Hurst, did, and the Lulu Hurst in my story did, was she performed across the country doing what she called tests of fulcrum and lever, and she became very, very famous working with canes and chairs. And what she was doing was manipulating people's ideas of power and electricity and magnetism at the end of the 19th century, when these things were new, when electricity was new and a little scary. And the real Lulu Hurst was a fantastic figure and an amazing figure. And my interest in her led me to wonder something that wasn't available in the research, which is, why'd you do it? And why did you quit?
Well, what's curious is, where did you get this inspiration from? I mean, did you get it in school? Was she someone you had studied?
No. Lulu Hurst is one of these people who, and I love stories of forgotten American history. She was crazy famous for about 18 months and then just disappeared. She married, had kids, and just became a society wife. But I found out about Lulu Hurst because about 10 years ago, my mother sent me a digital clipping from a magazine called Cassier's Magazine, which was an electrical engineering publication from the 1890s. And my mom just sent it to me as this sort of random, look at this crazy story. And it was a story about Lulu Hurst and what she had done, and this magazine was debunking her. Here's this teenage girl who said she could conduct electricity with her fingers, and of course she couldn't. And I was going, oh, really? Who are you, Lulu?
Wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so and from that, this book evolved.
The book evolved. Took me about 10 years to write it. I was doing other things. I was working on a nonfiction book. I teach full-time. But the research on this book was fantastically fun. Lulu Hurst wrote an autobiography, which I found, a Vanity Press piece, and I read it. And I also found online and in historical societies period newspaper clippings that covered her shows. She performed in Atlanta, in New York, in New Orleans, in Chicago. So her press, I read her press. And I also did some physical research. I went to where her house had been. Because she grew up in Cedartown, Georgia, which is about 90 minutes from where I live in Atlanta.
Have you always written?
Magnetic Girl is my third book. It's my first novel. And so I have written in one way or another my whole life, diaries and, short stories and just fun little things. But
do you have any advice you would give to young writers?
I would, yes. I teach writing. And the advice I would give to young writers is write. Just write. If you have a story to tell, if you can tell it with your mouth, if you can say it with your fingers. And start there. Don't worry about, is this the right word or who's going to publish it? Just get it out on the paper for yourself and then go from there.
Is there anything in books that you've seen that makes it an automatic great seller? Is there some idea, some way to write it?
I don't know that I can talk about what makes it a great seller because that's, so dependent on what the culture wants at a particular point or how something is promoted. But I think that a story that has multiple levels is a really good story to read. And by story, I mean nonfiction and fiction. On one hand, it's about, a girl on the vaudeville circuit in the 1880s. So that's one level of story. But another level of story might be women and identity and power and how we tell lies. And, I mean, all people, not just women, how we tell lies. And then how we realize that we want to fix that.
My debut novel, I'm Maurice Carlos Ruffin, and I wrote a novel called We Cast a Shadow. It was published by One World Random House. Came out in January, and it was a New York Times Editor's Choice for that month.
Wow.
And the book is about a family living in the South in the future, 50 years in the future. It's kind of satirical. It's also dealing with race, and it's a very interesting book in that I try to speculate what's going to happen to America, in a few decades from now.
What about the water? Is there going to be more water in Louisiana?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean,
50 years?
we already have plenty of water, and there's definitely more water in the future.
Wow. See, you're already predicting that. Well, what made you want to be a writer?
Well, I love to read. I think that storytelling is such an important part of the human experience. Children, you don't have to beg them to tell you a story. When they come home from school, they want to tell you about their entire day. And so I think as writers, we just tap into that same joy and we put it down on the page for other people to experience.
So what you're really saying is you haven't lost your joy of childhood.
That's exactly right. That's what I'm saying.
Is that what you would tell a new author that's wanting to write? You would say you can't lose your childhood.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, I think that writers need to understand that, writing is a joyous thing. And if you're not having fun, just keep changing until you find a way to write that is fun for you. I always enjoy my writing sessions.
Well, tell us a little bit about this Louisiana Book Festival.
Well, it's a great festival. I've been here a few times before. This is my first time as somebody who's published a book, but I've been involved because of stories I've published and because of my writing group, the Podunk Writers Alliance from New Orleans. And the festival always has a great turnout, a great mixture of writers, great events, great food, and you always leave feeling like you've learned something and had a good experience.
Wow.
So I have two books that are actually on the board. My book that sort of represents the festival today is Aging Out, which won the 2019 Teen Reader's Choice Award.
Oh.
And so, but that's my life story from about 18 until about 2016. So my struggles trying to, find my way. So I was a foster kid most of my childhood. And so when I graduated from high school, I just kind of fell apart because I didn't have a support system.
Wow. Well, tell us about being a foster child. What did you bring to this book that nobody else can find?
So the first thing I tried to do was be completely transparent. So I wanted people to get like the inside view of what it's like being a foster kid. I also wanted for children and adults who read it to understand that you're not by yourself. So a lot of people hesitate to talk about their struggles because they feel like they're on their own. So I did not paint myself as a superhero. I wanted to be transparent so people could connect with the feelings and again, let them know that you're not alone.
Well, when you were young and a foster child, did you always think you were going to write a book?
No, so I struggled. I struggled reading, and then I found out the second time I was in college that I was dyslexic. So I grew up my whole life thinking I was dumb. I really did. And so once I found out I was dyslexic, then it sort of changed my perspective, and never really dreamed of writing a book. I just had an interesting story to tell, and so the writing part came second.
So when you started writing, what was your inspiration to get started?
So I'd written kind of poems as I was a child growing up, but I remember going to speak at a assembly with kids, and after I spoke at the assembly, a lot of the kids, like 20 or 30 kids, came up and told me that they were foster kids or they had been in foster care. And so that was my sort of inspiration to write the story and to have kids have something that they could, take home with them that they could relate to. So that's really what got me started writing the book.
What would you advise young writers? What have you learned in writing this book that you think would be helpful to someone who wants to write a book?
Just don't believe everything you hear. So the first thing is just to write your book. Tell your story, use your own voice, don't try to mimic anyone else, and then believe in yourself. Do the best you can to surround yourself with people that are going to be encouraging, but at the same time, honest with you. But the most important thing is just to write your story and again, to be transparent about how you feel and what you think, and let that come through your writing.
Has anything really helped you succeed to actually get your story out there? Like anything that may have helped you to push you along and get it done? Because some writers have a lot of struggle with getting that little extra push to get the book actually.
So I'm probably the most non-traditional writer you'll ever meet. So when I was writing my book, instead of outlining the chapters, I broke mine down into little stories. So little bitty segments and memories that I had, and I put them in chronological order. Once I got them in chronological order, I literally jumped back and forth on whatever I felt like writing. So on Monday, I may write about something that I experienced when I was 6, and then on Thursday, it may be something that when I was 17. My motivation too to keep going has always been my children. So I didn't have a dad growing up, and I wanted to show my kids that you can do anything you set your mind to. Doesn't mean it's easy. And so when I felt like giving up and frustrated, I just pictured my children, and that kept me writing.
Well, this book is called Becoming Ronald Reagan, The Rise of a Conservative Icon, and it's the story of how Reagan, this liberal Democrat actor, Hollywood icon, becomes a conservative political icon, and it's all about that transition that he made in the mid-50s through the mid-60s, going from kind of a washed-up actor into a political person, and eventually governor of California was when the book ends. What
about Ronald Reagan inspired you to write this book?
I've written a lot of books about Democratic politicians, and I don't know. My most recent book was was a story involving the 1964 presidential election, and I knew about the speech that Reagan had given in 1964 on national television for Barry Goldwater, and it was the best speech of the campaign. It was the speech that launched Reagan's career. 2 years later, he runs and gets elected governor of California based on the the speech and how it propelled him into politics. And I wanted to originally just write a book about the speech and how the speech was the turning point in this man's career. And as I began to do the research on the speech, I realized there was a better story, which was how did he get to the speech? How did he become the person who was able to give the speech? And so I really just started pulling at strings, and what came out was a much more interesting story about how Reagan in the 1950s and early 60s became a conservative.
Do you think acting helped him?
Yeah, I think acting helped him a lot, not in the ways that I thought, and that was one of the big surprises for me, because the Reagan that I knew and maybe misunderstood was a Reagan who I thought just was, because he was an actor, was good at memorizing his lines and was good at playing a politician. And what I learned was that maybe there was some of that, especially when he was president, but when he was starting out, his acting helped him because he was very comfortable in front of a crowd.
Yeah.
He was very good at memorizing his lines, and because he was good at memorizing his lines, he didn't need to speak from a printed text like a lot of politicians do, so he was able to keep his eye on his audience all the time. And I think as much as anything, he became a good politician because he read his audience as well as any politician ever did. He always had his eyes on them. He always watched their reactions to what he was saying, and so he was always adjusting his speech, changing it, throwing out this story, putting something in, taking this anecdote out, putting this better anecdote in, and he could see in real time how his speeches were going over. And he, over about a 10-year period, in these training grounds of giving these speeches in these small towns around in rural America, you know, he became a really skilled politician, a very skilled and effective speaker. But it wasn't that he was acting, it was because he was using his acting skills and relating them to this new way of life.
Well, tell us, what made you want to be a writer?
I started out as a journalist. I was a newspaper reporter, and then got into politics and missed the writing. So I was working on Capitol Hill and working in politics for 20 years, and lucky enough to have worked for politicians who let me write on the side and were supportive of me writing about politics while I was also working for them. But I got into it because I missed the writing. I love journalism. I loved writing, and I always have loved writing. And so I found a way to do it. I just found a way, even when I wasn't doing that for a living, I found a way to make it my living.
Would that be some of the advice you would give to young authors today when they would say, how can I become a writer?
Yeah, I tell people, I tell my students, I teach writing now at LSU, and so I tell them you just got to, first of all, you got to read. You can't write, I don't think anybody wants to write unless they also read. It's not, you don't want to create words unless you're a consumer of those words. So I tell them, read good writing, read a lot of different writers, a lot of different styles of writing and genres, and I mean, I love fiction, and I use a lot of techniques of fiction in my history writing. You want to tell a good story, you want to draw people in, you want to borrow those techniques. And the other thing I tell them is you've got to just do the work. You got to sit down and write. Books don't just spontaneously appear on a page. You've got to pound out the words. And so I tell people all the time, if you want to write a book, you got to be willing to sit down every day for about 100 days and write 1,000 words a day, and that's how you write a book. You just do it one day at a time, 1,000 words, maybe 500 words the next day, but you just keep plugging away, and after a couple hundred days, you've got a book on your hands, or at least you have the first draft.
Wow. Tell us, what do you think about the Louisiana Book Festival?
Well, I love it. I've been on the board of the book festival since its inception, so I've been doing this for a long time, been supporting the board, been supporting the book festival, been involved in the book festival in all kinds of ways ever since it began, and I think it's one of the best things we've got going in Baton Rouge and Louisiana. It's great for me to come out once a year and see 25,000 people who come down just because they want to read books, just because they want to meet the authors and just celebrate books and writing. I mean, it's a wonderful thing that we've got this here, and that people in this community and in this part of the state support it like they do.
The name of my novel is The 14th of September, and it is a woman's story of Vietnam, and that's what makes it distinctive, because all of the vast majority of things that have been written about Vietnam have been by men. And this is actually, this time frame, fall of 2019, is the 50th anniversary of the time frame when some of the major things around the Vietnam War actually happened stateside. So first draft lottery, Kent State, And my book takes place late 69, early 70 during the course of a school year.
Well, what made you pick this to talk about and to write a novel about?
Well, two reasons. One is, two reasons. One is that I think it's been an area of history that made a profound impact on the country, and we just haven't spent enough time understanding it. Mm-hmm. And if we don't understand our history, we learn our history from history books and from facts, but we understand it from narrative, and there just hasn't been enough about it because we're embarrassed about the war. It's like somebody in one of my book signings said they called it the Voldemort of wars.
Oh.
Well, we didn't win. We were terrible to our vets, and there were atrocities. All that is true, but it's been 50 years, and now we can look at it more objectively and learn, how did it really happen? What are the lessons that we can learn? And the point that I'm making here at the Louisiana Festival is that we need to learn from new voices. And women, they're a very important voice. So my book is from the point of view of a 19-year-old female activist on campus, and I'm being paired tomorrow morning with Bev Marshall, who was a military wife during that time.
The first book I wrote was The Darkest Time of Night, and my new novel, The Dark Above, is the sequel that has came out this summer. Both tell the story of a family saga when it comes to the unexplained disappearances of people. The first novel, The Darkest Time of Night, begins with the disappearance of a U.S. Senator's grandson. And when no one from the FBI to the National Guard can find the boy, it falls to the wife of the senator, the boy's grandmother, to ultimately understand what's happened, because the disappearance of her grandson eerily reflects the research that she used to do in the late 1960s of people who had vanished. And so she has to decide how much she's willing to expose of her past in order to find her grandson. And that sets the stage for these books.
Is any of it based on truth?
So an interesting story is that my mother-in-law, years and years and years ago, when my father-in-law was in law school, had to find a job. She had to support them. And she took a job as a secretary in an astronomy department at a university in Illinois. And when she was working as a secretary, she worked for a professor who did UFO research. And when she had that experience, taking these messages from all over the world about missing people and abductions and all of this crazy experience, that got me thinking this could make one hell of a thriller.
Okay, my book is called Louisiana Midrash. It's a book of poetry. About half the book is poetry, is biblical, Torah-centered poetry, trying to look at the lives of maybe some of the adjacent characters, the characters who are adjacent to the main characters. So not Moses, but maybe Miriam, his sister, not Isaac, but Esau.
What made you come up with this idea?
I can't say exactly. I love Midrash, which is the story tradition which part of which is the story tradition in Torah. And part of which is used to write parables. And that is one of the things they often do, is take a small oddity in the story and explain it and come up with a story and a reason why.
Have you always wanted to be a writer?
You know, I don't think that I always knew that it was even possible. I used to write stories. I do remember reading stories to my parents, but it wasn't something that I knew that people could have a profession in. It wasn't until much later that I realized that. I mean, I couldn't even say, in reading a lot of the books that I read as a child, I never noticed the author. I was interested in the story, but I never noticed the author. And it wasn't until much later, say college, that I realized that, oh, you know, people make a living doing this type of thing.
So you would say it's a good fit for you?
I would say it's a good fit. I mean, that's not what I do for a living. I'm a computer programmer, but I enjoy, it's definitely an outlet. It definitely engages me creatively. I I definitely enjoy it. It allows me to work out things in my head. You know, if I have issues, that allows me to say, what do I think about this? What do I really think? Because a lot of times people jump to emotions without considering what is behind that emotion and what theories and logic are they using. So it allows me to work that out sometimes.
Well, if you had advice to give for a young author getting started, what kind of advice would you give them?
Oh, there's always the typical advice, which is read a lot. Read, and write, and don't listen to what people tell you because people will tell you that, oh no, you can't do that, you can't do that. But I would say read and continue to write, and even if no one accepts your work, continue to write, because there are so many small little journals and magazines and whatever out there that are looking for a different voice. And
Well, tell us, what do you think of the Louisiana Book Festival?
this is the first time that I've been, so so far so good. Yeah, it's a surprise. I was, you know, this was my first book of poetry, and I was happy to be invited. I'm enjoying it so far.
Poetry is an unusual book to write these days. Why poetry?
Why poetry? Poetry, I love both fiction and poetry. Poetry is short. I can, for whatever reason, I don't mind sitting and revising and revising and revising poetry, where fiction, it's like, I get to the point where I say, it's finished, leave me alone, it's finished.
What a great end. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful...
My book is called The Accident of Color, A Story of Race and Reconstruction. It's about civil rights activism just after the Civil War, particularly in New Orleans, that went a lot further than I had realized, or most historians really covered, including desegregating the local public schools, streetcar system, police department, opera house, et cetera, et cetera.
What made you come up with this idea?
When I moved to New Orleans in 2011, I decided to sort of educate myself on the history of the city. I do have some very tangential family in New Orleans, but most of my family is from Birmingham and Atlanta and other places. And I just did a lit search for articles about the school desegregation of New Orleans, I thought, in the 1960s. And I got over 100 hits, and 99 of them about the 1960s, and one of them was about the 1870s. So I was just like, whoa, wait, what's that? You know, so I clicked the 1870s one, and this was like a sort of rabbit hole that only ended many years later with this book.
Wow! And tell us, are you a history major?
I've always been. I mean, I'm really a journalist by trade. I've always loved history and read history and increasingly written more and more history. I used to kind of have to sneak it into articles, and now in sort of book format, I can kind of fully go historical. My favorite sources are people who've already passed away.
Well, have you always written?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who writes exclusively nonfiction, as opposed to fiction or poetry, I mean, yes, I've always written because I would always have assignments like turn in an essay on this topic in middle school or high school. But it was only really in college that I realized that, like, oh, this is actually what I really love to do, or love is a weird term, what I'm enthralled by.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, if you had advice for young authors, what would it be?
Read a ton, and read what you love. Read the books you're interested in. I mean, I remember the first nonfiction book I loved was, I was maybe in kindergarten or first grade. It was a biography of Abraham Lincoln, and I'd been given all of these fiction books that you learn to read with these stories, and I always remember being like, I could read them, like I could make the word sounds, but I was never excited about the story till I was like finally had a true story, and then I was so excited about it. So yeah, read what you love, and if what you love is nonfiction, like, don't feel bad about that. Embrace that.
Well, when you wrote this book, what surprised you in your research?
Sure. I mean, the initial surprise was just that there was essentially a full-fledged civil rights movement in New Orleans in the 1870s that was ultimately defeated, but fought long and hard, really well beyond the collapse of Reconstruction into the 1890s even. Streetcars of New Orleans are not resegregated until 1902. Same with the police department. By the time the streetcars in the police department of New Orleans are resegregated, they're like a handful of little old ladies and little old men who can even remember an all-white police department or a segregated streetcar system. So that surprised me. It's sort of both inspirational and somewhat terrifying too. You kind of think about what we might be taking for granted in our own time too.
Is this your first time at the Louisiana Book Festival?
It is my first time at the Louisiana Book Festival. It's my third book. It's my first book specifically about Louisiana. So I'm really excited to be here, and I've been really heartened actually by how embraced the book's been by the community in New Orleans in particular.
Oh, well, I've been doing that for, I guess, quite a few years now. I've published 4 collections of poetry. My 5th is scheduled to be released sometime next year. So keep pretty busy in that world.
Did you always write poems, or is it something that started later on?
For me, it started much later in my life. I had been doing lots of other things, pursuing other interests and careers, but poetry was really always there, you know. And I got really serious about it, I guess sometime around 2003, 2004, when I, in fact, went to work for the state of Louisiana and attended my first poetry workshop, the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop. That was in 2005, and got exposed to just another entirely different world, and met and was taught by some very talented poets, award-winning poets across the country. So I just kept going, you know, attending more workshops. I got sometime around, I think, 2008, I got serious about maybe pursuing a graduate degree in creative writing, so I did that at the University of New Orleans late in my life. Went back to school, to formally, I guess, study poetry and creative writing. So, and from that, I was fortunate to publish my first book, and so here I am now with 4 books.
Did you have any idea that you would be the Louisiana poet?
None whatsoever. That came as quite a shock.
Well, how did it feel when you were named that?
Well, again, I was floating, I guess, off the ground for a few days, but I don't know, I was fortunate to be nominated for the position, and had some great support from colleagues, other poets across the state, and so it just happened. So now it's, I'm formally in that role, traveling the state, reading poetry, doing poetry workshops, really trying to broaden the public's awareness and appreciation for that art.
Well, it's such
and how it can enrich our lives.
It's almost an obscure art form these days.
Oh, but it's a very old.
Very old.
Very old.
And how do you tell young people then when you're out? How did they become a poet?
Yeah, you'd be surprised the amount of, I guess, of interest there is in poetry from junior high school students, and many young people are doing spoken word poetry these days. In fact, I was at Southern University earlier this week judging a poetry slam competition, So it's there, and I think young people find that art form as a way of really just expressing themselves and getting a lot of things out, So
has it helped you as you've gone? It really?
Yeah.
How do you feel being a poet has
I don't know.
changed your life?
That's what I am now.
Yeah.
I for years I struggled with really trying to understand who that person was, and why I was doing it. So poetry, I say, found me before I found poetry, because it was tugging, kind of tugging at me. I had always loved literature, loved to read literature, and thought that if I was going to write, it would be more as an essayist. And so I did a lot of that, just kind of dabbling, not even thinking that any of that material would be ever be published, but just it was in me and I had to get it out. But somewhere along the line, I guess in the late 90s, poetry said, "Hey, here I am,"
And here you are.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
Let's start this
Well,
journey.
what do you think about the Louisiana Book Festival?
Oh, it's a great event. This is my 4th year. I participated previously as a writer, as a poet, and I guess a poet that had published books. And that was a great experience, just being on panels, reading your work and meeting other poets, just interacting with other writers. It's just a great experience. This year, my role has changed a little bit. So I'll be, tomorrow I'll start the day with a conversation with Jack Bedell, the former poet laureate, great poet laureate, served for 2 years. So Jack and I will start the morning with a conversation, and that'll be followed by 2 panels, poetry panels that I'll moderate with a great lineup of Louisiana poets reading. Sometime in the morning, then there's one in the afternoon. So it's going to be a good day.
It sounds like a wonderful day for you.
I'm pumped up about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
So I'm the editor of an anthology called What My Mother and I Don't Talk About. It's 15 writers writing about, for better or worse, what they don't talk about with their mothers. And it's based on an essay I wrote that I spent well over a decade working on about my mom still being married to my abusive stepfather. And it took me many years to realize that what I was actually trying to write about was the fact that I'm a daughter longing for a better relationship with my mom and the fracture that this caused in our relationship since she's still married to him. So the book is there, it's very uplifting in certain parts too. It's not just, sad stories. I had a bunch of wonderful writers writing about things that they can't talk about or couldn't talk about with their parents in circumstances where like their mothers are no longer alive. But for me, the important thing behind this book is that breaking the silence is a way to heal. So the subtitle is called 15 Writers Break the Silence.
This is a very interesting topic.
Yeah.
Is it a topic that you had thought about previously?
Always.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's been the story that has kind of been inside me for years now because the complicated relationship I have with my own mom is one of the most painful things in my life. And the opening line of my essay is, our mothers are our first homes. That's why we're always trying to return to them, to have a place where we belong or where we fit. And I feel like I've always been trying to return to my mom somehow. And I've realized that the title of my essay, What My Mother and I Don't Talk About, really struck a nerve with a lot of people.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what has been the response to this book?
So many people have told me that it fills a need for them that they haven't seen before of looking at mothers as multidimensional human beings rather than putting them up on some pedestal. The idea that mothers can be flawed, mothers can be complicated, mothers are human beings too. And so my hope with this book is that it will allow for conversations, even if they're painful, conversations between mothers and children to break these what can be toxic silences.
That can be helpful.
Yes, yeah,
in their lives.
Exactly. And in one case in this book, one of the writers already really had this incredible moment with her mom where there was healing involved. So she wrote about growing up in an immigrant family with a mentally ill mother, and she wrote about what that was like. And in an immigrant family, of all families, like, it's really not okay to break these kinds of silences. So
this sounds like a book that could have a lot of sequels.
yeah, it could be. It could be. But she sent this essay to her mom before the book came out, and was very scared of what her mom would say. And her mom wrote back a beautiful email saying, "I'm so proud of you. This essay is going to help a lot of people." And it's really helped them heal in their relationships. So we included that as a postscript in the book after that essay. So that's just one example of the kind of power that breaking silences can have.
Was editing it kind of cathartic for you?
Yeah, cathartic, but also I've also needed a lot of therapy this year too. I mean, it is therapeutic to write, but it's still, you have to process a lot of this stuff off the page too. So.
What do you think is the best way that you can characterize being an author? What is so great about it?
Well, I've wanted to be an author since I was a little kid, making up stories about the lake that I grew up on that was supposedly built over an Indian burial ground. So I was always obsessed with ghost stories and making up stories about those ghosts. So I think the best part about being an author is being able to base your life around storytelling. Stories are what defines our lives, right? We're always trying to make sense of our life through stories. So
I was here 4 years ago when I was promoting a book, an anthology of my obituaries called Getting Off at Elysian Fields. This time I'm here because I am an author with Susan Langenhennig, Danielle Del Sol, and Chris Granger of a book by the Preservation Resource Center called Building on the Past, Saving Historic New Orleans. It's a coffee table book just in time for Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa about not only beautifully restored buildings, but also about ways to restore historic properties if you don't have a boatload of cash. And because of my background in writing obituaries, I was asked to write 7 obituaries of departed buildings, which makes sense because they were, well, most of them were gone before there was a preservation movement in New Orleans. And then 2 just fell. One was a Katrina casualty, the other was a casualty of greed, the Rivergate. And it's been an interesting journey. The research is fascinating. And the thing, I think buildings, like people, have personalities. I have the advantage of knowing some of these buildings that have been razed, the old St. Charles Hotel, the old Main Library, and I remember them, and people need to appreciate what we've lost and also the importance of keeping what we have. Not clinging to every structure, but holding on to the historically and architecturally valid buildings so that we shouldn't lose them. It's tough because New Orleans is not a rich city, but the Preservation Resource Center has shown how preservation can be achieved with a bunch of good members who will donate money, plus the ability to attract grants, all sorts of grants, to help make buildings viable. I mean, Anne Masson, who lives in the French Quarter, she and her husband, Frank Masson, an architect, bought a house that had been built 2 years after the Louisiana Purchase.
Oh my.
Oh yeah, and they brought that sucker back, and it is gorgeous. It's in our book. And then the Wedding Cake House on St. Charles Avenue needed a lot of work done, and that's in the book. That family poured a lot of money into that. And then Treme, which is the oldest African-American community in the United States, there's a wonderful couple, Adolph and Nadja Bynum, who are restoring Treme house by house by house. They care. They also know good investments when they see them.
Wow.
Yeah, those people, Adolph and Nadja are a wonderful couple. I mean, all you need to know about them is this. When they were recording, their dates were at Home Depot.
Yeah, it was kind of like flip or flop, huh?
Pretty much. And so they are passionate about saving buildings and restoring them and putting them back into commerce. And that's what the PRC is doing. It's not, this book, if it proves nothing else, it will show that it is not just an organization of women with white gloves who live in the Garden District. There are people all over the city who are doing this work because they care about the heritage and the culture and the architecture.
What is the name of the book again?
Building on the Past, Saving Historic New Orleans.
Wonderful.
The authors are Susan Langenhennig, Danielle Del Sol, yours truly, John Pope, with photography by Chris Granger. It is gorgeous. It is a coffee table book, and the Preservation Resource Center is publishing it, and proceeds from the sales of this book will underwrite future publications. So that's an extra incentive for us to get out there and just hustle the daylights out of this book.
I actually came here to volunteer. My college professor, she volunteers every year. She was like, we'll give you 5 extra bonus points for your next assignment if you come and volunteer. So it was a great opportunity to come to a thing that I used to come to as a kid and also get 5 bonus points. I used to come when I was, I think it was 5 to 8 with my grandfather. He used to take my brother and I. I love reading. So probably listening to the authors and their take on the book that they've written. It was great to actually volunteer to be a part of that too. I believe personally that life is about knowledge and you obtain that knowledge from other people. So I think coming to a book festival is a great way to obtain that.
Today we have the book festival where we have book and all kind of activity for kids. And also we have food, music, and people even have picnic size. I think I like it all. There is part for everybody, for every age, and especially you can join the kids also. And they even have cooking demonstrations. We volunteer in the room where others share their view and opinion and the process of their writing.
I just moved here, and so actually getting able to see all of the different aspects of it and the culture of it and kind of get a just experience Baton Rouge and some of the things that go here. I just got here, but I have really started digging into the cuisine, and I came here to find a good cookbook and kind of meet some of that, and so that's where I started off, and we're about to go explore the rest.
I'm here to find local artists and books and really see what's going on as far as reading. My favorite part is meeting the local artists because there's a lot of local artists here, and I guess my aspect was trying to find the local Black artists, especially for books and poetry. So I've been able to meet a few of them, which is super awesome. It's important to read. You see a lot of statistics on folks that don't have the proper reading level, and so to find books that you can relate to and really be able to dive in and create that interest. I'm doing it for myself and hopefully finding my nephews some books too, where they can find that same interest. This is the first time I came to this festival. I've been to some of the local I guess artsy type of things, but I've never actually made it to the book festival.
It's been fantastic. Our all-time high attendance was about 28,000. So are we saying we want to get to 30, we want to break our record? And last night at the authors party, we broke our record. I think we had about 400 people at the authors party, which is our thank you to the authors. So that could be an indication that today might be a record breaker.